Okay, here's the next part for the introductory lecture for Scott High School Sociology, PowerPoint B. There are two types of sociology that we'll talk about now, structural and interactional. Structural sociology focuses on the group, and that's where we're going to focus largely in this course. Interactional sociology is where the focus is upon the individual, and there are some occasions where it's appropriate to focus on how groups or culture impact the individual. Now, structural sociology focuses again on the group, excuse me, or aggregates. We'll discuss what that means later. You don't have to worry about that right now. So, a structural sociological perspective would be interested in, for example, you guys are in high school, so I might be interested in how high school students as a group feel about premarital sex. And I can imagine what I might get as a response when I ask that question. Illegal drug use, politics, homosexuality. I may ask a different group. I may ask your parents as a group how they feel about, premarital sex, illegal drug use, politics, homosexuality. My guess is that I would get some different responses, especially on the first couple, your group compared to your parents' group. But that's partly what structural sociologists would look at, are the differences in groups. I could also do this in terms of time. Premarital sex, high school students may be more accepting of that today than maybe in the 1940s or 1950s. So there are a lot of different ways to look at structural sociology. Interactional sociology, on the other hand, focuses on you alone, you the individual. So I could ask you as an individual, how do you feel about premarital sex? Your individual attitude about that may not be in line with your group, your peer group as a whole. Or it may be. I may ask you individually how you feel about illegal drugs or politics or homosexuality. Now, back to structural sociology for just a minute. Theodore Newcomb did a lot of studies on reference groups. Now, I'm going to give you a definition. You want to jot this down. A reference group, by definition, as you can kind of see right there, is a group of people you compare yourself to and look up to the most. Again, a reference group, a group of people that you look up to or compare yourself to the most. What we find that as children, very, very young children, look up to their parents, for better or for worse. Parents are the main reference group. When children develop into adolescence, they tend to move more away from their parents, and their reference group become largely their age-appropriate peers, their friends. As you get even older and you get out of high school and college and into your 30s and your 40s, your reference group may shift again, or you may be more independent with your thinking and not look up to other groups so much. He did a famous study on reference group at Bennington College, which is in the northeastern part of this country. What he found was that this college, freshmen, when they entered school, were very conservative. They had very conservative views, ideologies, beliefs, and those came largely from their parents. Their parents were largely conservative. By the time these same freshmen were seniors 4 years later, they were completely liberal in terms of their attitudes, their ideologies, their beliefs. So what caused the change? Well, their reference group shifted. In college, it shifted away from their parents and more toward their older peers. They looked up more to the senior class who were more liberal in their ideas and ideologies. So reference groups can shift, and this reflects structural sociology because we can look at the groups themselves, the freshmen versus compared to the seniors. Those groups had different ideas, and the seniors impacted the freshmen. We can look at it in terms of religion. Baptists as a group or an aggregate, they tend to make less money over the course of a lifetime compared to Catholics. They tend to come from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds. They tend to give more money to the church overall, which is ironic, and they tend to be more conservative. Catholics, on the other hand, as a group or an aggregate, they tend to make more money over the course of a lifetime. They come from higher socioeconomic status backgrounds or more well-to-do backgrounds. They give money to the church, but not as much as Baptists in some cases, which is interesting. And they tend to be a bit more liberal in terms of their ideologies, their values, and their beliefs. So we could look at Baptists versus Catholics just as groups. A lot of you like music. I know I like music as well, something we can relate to. We could look at structural sociology in terms of music and different genres of music. Here's what we understand about blues. I realize my camera's kind of coming in and out of focus a little bit here. Sorry. 41% of non-whites prefer this music, while 28% of whites prefer. And I'm using the language of the study here, just so you know. 17% of Hispanics prefer this music. Seniors and younger children are much less likely to like blues and R&B than baby boomers, which would be probably your grandparents, or Generation Xers, which would be my generation, and I'm 41. Classic rock. 52% of white people like it. 29% of non-whites prefer this music. Country music. 45% of white people. 18% of non-white people like country music. So again, we start to understand, we can start asking questions later. Well, why is it that largely white people like country music and racial minorities tend not to like it? The sociologist in us can start to understand, well, the values of country music, where it came from, what it speaks to, largely speak to still Caucasian values and attitudes. Appalachia, where you have more representation of white people. So we can start to try to peel back the layers and understand this. Some other things we know: the higher the educational attainment, in other words, the more education you have, the less likely you are to like country music, and vice versa. The less education you have, the more likely you are to like country music. Does that mean that if you like country music that you're an idiot, or that you're quote-unquote redneck or unsophisticated? No, that's not what that means. But we could start to understand sociologically why these trends exist. Rap, hip-hop, most popular among ethnic minorities, less popular among white people. The more education you have, the less likely you are to like rap and hip-hop, and vice versa. I have 4 degrees, so I guess I'm considered to be educated or have higher levels of educational attainment, but there's a lot of rap and hip-hop that I do like. So I mean, there are always exceptions to these rules. Heavy metal. I grew up with heavy metal. Generation Xers, that's me, people my age, your parents' age probably. The net kids, that would be your generation. They like it more than the baby boomer generation. That would be your grandparents, for example. Gospel music, 33% of women like it, where only 21% of men like it. So we could look at this in terms of gender breakdown. Why is it that more women than men like gospel music? Why is it that older people like it more than younger people? So we're looking at these trends and these preferences in terms of group. Jazz music, non-white people prefer it, or ethnic minorities prefer it more than white people. The more education that you have, the higher your educational attainment, the more likely you are to like jazz music, and vice versa. So again, we start to understand, or try to understand, why that might be the case. And we'll get into that as we go, as we peel back the layers using our sociological imaginations. Okay, come on, focus. There we go. Now back to interactional sociology. I used to work for a warden in one of our prisons, and he was an ex-state trooper. And he would always say, people do things, individual people do things in groups that they would never, ever do alone or one-on-one. He used to patrol the football stadium, Mountaineer football games. And he said after big wins or after controversial games, the students and the fans would do horrifically awful things to each other and to the police. They would throw bottles, they would hurl golf balls, they would just really assault the officers on the field. But they did it in a group. People, when they act in a group, they feel like they're less threatened, they feel less accountable, they're not going to get caught maybe as much, or that it's more okay. They do things they would never do one-on-one. If it was just this one person and a cop on the street and nobody else around, this person would likely not hurl a liquor bottle or a golf ball at the police officer. So people act differently when they're alone as opposed to when they're in groups. Some more discussion. There's a famous study, Morse and Durgan did a study in 1967. I like to call it the Mr. Clean, Mr. Dirty study. And I can discuss this with you briefly. The idea of this study was to see how people would feel, how their self-image or self-esteem would be impacted by others around them. There are a lot of theories in the social sciences that people's self-esteem comes largely, or the way they feel about themselves comes largely from those around them. If you're around people who are super successful, really attractive, on the ball, then you may feel a little worse about yourself. If you're around people who are not quite as talented as you, or not maybe as good looking as you might feel better about yourself. Well, is this just shallow, superficial stuff? Well, this study set out to try to examine that. And in this study, basically what they found, they set up a mock interview where individuals thought they were interviewing for a graduate position. Really what they were doing was taking a self-esteem survey. The first setup, you had people come in and they were applying for a job against others who were very well put together, very attractive, very articulate, super intelligent. And at the end of the survey, at the end of the interview, they were given a self-esteem survey. And guess how they felt about themselves as individuals? Not as great, because they were comparing themselves to these people they perceived to be better, smarter, more attractive. And vice versa. The second setup, you had people who were they were kind of slobs, they didn't dress very well, were not very articulate. So again, at the end of this study, the result was the opposite. Individuals felt higher self-esteem. They felt more confident, more articulate. They felt better about their chances of getting that job. It was all based on a social comparison and comparing themselves to people around them. Solomon Asch did a series of studies on conformity. If you conform, that means you just kind of go along just to fit in. Nobody tells you that you have to wear this t-shirt. No one holds a gun to your head and says you will wear this t-shirt or else. You buy it because you want to fit in with everybody else. That's conformity. It's an example of conformity. And I don't know if you can make this out. I think you can. There's an obvious answer. If I ask you which line is longest, it's obviously A. You can see by looking at it. Now, in a study, Asch wanted to see if people would conform. He had people lined up at a table, and he had 8 or 9 people who would purposely give the wrong answer. He would ask the question, which line is longest? Person says B. Next person says B. Next person says B. You get the idea. And then it gets down to the 9th person, and that's the person who is not in on the study. The person very often goes along with the group and says B. Even though he or she knows A is obviously the longer line, they still give the wrong answer because they feel the pressure to conform on something as basic as this task. And we'll call that the end of this part. Thank you.